I'd like to say immediately just how much I welcome today, because I think this initiative is probably, if anything, a bit overdue in Scotland. As the film suggested, there's been a lot of attention to the role of the business community right across the world, in academia and elsewhere, and I felt for a long time that we could probably do much more in Scotland. So I think this immensely important subject it's great that we've all got here today, and I thank NIDOS very much indeed for orchestrating this event. So, how can business contribute to and how can it benefit from the huge international development challenge that we face? I'm not going to elaborate a great deal on that challenge today, because I think that people in the room are probably pretty familiar with some of the very major challenges that we do face. In some respects, progress has been good towards the development goals. In other respects, it's been pretty disappointing. I think we'd all agree, and there's a long way to go. My guess is today, because you've come voluntarily to this meeting, is that most of us in this room accept the crucial role that business can and should play in the development field. And I think that one of the objectives today is to try and inject real momentum into the role that business can play. I want to briefly offer you a framework, if I can. I want to briefly offer you a framework and a context for our thinking today before we get into what I think of as being the real presentations for today. And I want to just touch on three different issues as part of that framework. First of all, what are our shared objectives and the fundamental role of the business community in international development? Then I want to say something about the big challenges that we undoubtedly do face. And then just in finishing, I want to say something about the role of government and what they can contribute to this whole issue. But let me start by saying something about our shared objectives. I suspect that in this room there are quite a lot of different emphases about how international development can go forward. But I also imagine that fundamentally there's a very strong shared and common purpose here, an understanding that while development is by no means only about economic growth, growth is nonetheless the key to addressing the crisis of poverty and addressing the development goals, and that if we see growth as central, then businesses must play a very critical role. That seems self-evident. But we are talking about particular types of growth here. We're talking about growth that benefits the poor in developing countries. So we're talking about models of economic development and models of business development that are inclusive and which are sustainable. So we are fussy about what we mean by that. But the key point today for me is not just that Scottish business can be a really powerful player and a powerful contributor to this challenge, but it's also that in collaboration with Scottish NGOs and Scottish universities and other groupings in Scotland, Scottish business can be all the more effective and all the more powerful. I think immense knowledge and experience of working in developing countries resides in our NGOs and in our universities and elsewhere. And that knowledge and experience, I think, is potentially of huge value and untapped at the moment within our business community to a large extent. I want to offer you a little picture, because I think in pictures sometimes, which is a very simple representation really of what business can add, I think, to the development challenge. If you start with the red blob on the left, which is the business community activities, I've really identified a wide spectrum of activity, because my own view is that business can contribute in a huge range of possible ways. And I've just picked out 4 channels here, and you may have others that you think ought to be there. But if you look at the link between the red blob on the left and the green blob, that's really, I think, where much of our thinking often goes. Is to do with the impact of business in quite a direct sense on the economy through its commercial activities. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But I've also identified 3 other links there, going from the business activity blob down to the 3 yellow circles below. And they, for me, illustrate the breadth of the role that business can play, partly in promoting the enhancement of business capacity through the transfer of knowledge and skills, partly influencing the rules and regulations of the global international system for trade and business and the practices and policies that are evolved there. And thirdly, of course, the way in which businesses can have a wide impact on many other objectives of international development, not just growth in that specific sense through its impact on education, health, environment, and so on. And they, in turn, have the capacity to feed through into greater economic growth and ultimately towards the alleviation of poverty. So that's a very simplistic picture, but let me just put a little bit more flesh on the bones of that, because I think today many of the presentations fairly naturally drop somewhere into that little framework. This picture, I'm not going to talk through every line, you'll be pleased to hear, but it's really answering the question, what benefits can business really generate here? And the way I've set it up is that in the left-hand column, those are the big chunks of activity, if you like, that business engages in. And the second column are the sort of things that business does. And the key column, in a way, is the third column, is what actual benefit is derived from business activity in developing countries. And at the top, I've got 3 or 4 rows which are what I might call commercial activity, covering the production, purchasing of developing country products, working on aid-funded businesses, and supplying capital investment, whether from productive enterprises or from institutional investors. But those are the commercial activities that businesses engage in. And they have really powerful impacts upon the economies, whether it's in a very direct sense because of production, or in less direct senses because of the all-important local sourcing that goes on, or because of the way in which they facilitate the links between very small producers and very sophisticated markets in developing countries, and a whole range of other things around development projects for which businesses play a key role, as well as the way in which the all-important finance and capital flows to these countries to support growth. And then the bottom 3 rows are loosely what you might call the corporate global responsibility agenda, the 3 areas where you could argue, and some people do argue, that they're not necessary. I would probably differ from that view, because I think that there are great benefits to business from pursuing these particular lines of activity. Partly it's using the great knowledge and the skill base within our companies, partly it's using their money, and part of it is their role in influencing the huge debates that go on around global trade and global regulations in the WTO and the EU. But my view is that that huge range of business activity is, in some senses, untapped when we try to really see what the impact might be for international development. So the big question, I think, for us is, can this business involvement be significantly increased? And how can it be shaped to be more powerful and more beneficial to address the poverty challenge? And today, what I call the real presentations that will follow mine, I think we'll get into lots of examples, and we'll pick up some of these themes and some of those linkages that I've described there. And some of the examples are very, very good indeed, and I've been lucky to visit some of those myself. But I want to spend a moment on what I think of as some of the key challenges, because I don't think we should be naive about this, and I think part of today is to be open and honest and frank about some of the very real obstacles that do exist and some of the real world problems that exist. Otherwise, why hasn't business engagement in the past been as extensive and as intensive as perhaps we might have wished? And why do we feel, or why do I feel, that this is an underdeveloped area that we can exploit more? I'm going to very quickly touch on 3 different, what I think are very difficult questions. The first is to point out that businesses have to live in the real world, and obviously, therefore, we have to ask the hard question, what is in it for them? Why do they want to engage in this sort of work? I think it's often asserted that business leaders see their prime responsibility, and maybe their legal responsibility, as being towards their shareholders and their commercial interests. I don't fully accept that explanation, but what I would stress is that I believe there are very strong business reasons, hard business reasons, to understand the commercial opportunities and to have a greater business involvement in developing countries. But in addition, I think we shouldn't underestimate the corporate reputation, which is now a very highly prized asset. It partly derives from the hard business success, of course, I don't deny that for a moment, but it also derives from a sense of their contribution to the broader global objectives of society. This corporate responsibility work can be immensely valuable, and indeed it is. But probably in the long term, ultimately, it's building up the mutually beneficial commercial activity which will lead to the greatest impacts. So I think today our question is, can we support our business community to understand and to identify specific areas of business activity which really would demonstrate this potential? And we have some great speakers later on. I presume that Brendan and Tara and Sarah will all be in this territory, and James, sorry, will all be in this territory of looking at why there are benefits to Scottish business from working in these difficult areas sometimes. The second point I want to make is that developing countries are also part of the real world. Global competition is a reality, and so for any internationally traded good or service, the degree of competition is not only great, but has been growing over recent years. So for any business, there is a commercial imperative. We can't escape that fact. And I think that whether we're talking about price competition or non-price competition in terms of the quality of goods and services, there are very, very difficult challenges here. And so working to help companies in that sense in developing countries, can they respond? That is a very big question for us. I'll say little about the labour market challenge, except to note that there is an ongoing, and many of you, all of you, will be very familiar with the challenge of how we employ staff in developing countries. What is a fair wage? What are fair conditions? And in a global economy, that is a very difficult question, I think, to answer. As far as the role of government is concerned, I think the question is, what can it do? What can it add? And this little table here just gives you a very, very simple framework of the sorts of things that, certainly when I was in the government, we were thinking about in terms of what government with a small g might do. And it reflects the earlier table, I think, in the sense that on the left hand we've got the sorts of activities which are very important, but on the right are the sorts of things that the government might do to assist. I think one of the points I'll make, because I don't want to go through the whole table, is just to reiterate the fact that the government itself is a huge participator in commercial activity, and I think sometimes we overlook this. As a procurer of goods, at least a third of the Scottish budget, for example, goes on purchasing goods and services, very considerable amounts of money. But also a lot of the government's work is involved in promoting Scottish business, both in Scotland but also internationally. And so the work of the Enterprise Network, the work of SDI, Scottish Development International, are potentially hugely important. And I guess the question that this begs is, in promoting Scottish business internationally, does it help the international development agenda? Is it consistent with the international development agenda? How might it be used in a stronger way to complement the explicitly international development agenda that the government pursues? The next bunch of things, which I won't go through in detail, but it sets out some of the sorts of supportive work that government can help with. Facilitating linkages, providing knowledge of where contributions can be made, using indeed the great pool of skills that reside within the government in terms of knowledge about how business can be assisted, whether it's in the starting up of business or whether it's in the mentoring of business. And of course there are implications always here for resources, and the government has, certainly in Scotland, has some resources which I hope will be maintained, which can contribute to building these linkages. But in principle, the government can be a great catalyst in building some of these links. I won't say any more about government because I don't want to preempt what I think Colin will be talking about in a moment. But what I wanted to do was just finish with one little slide where there are a few very basic and in some senses very simple propositions, and then a few of the questions which I think are very, very difficult in many ways. As far as the simple propositions are concerned, it seems to me self-evident that we face huge challenges still in terms of global poverty, and we have to recognise that the business community must make a major contribution to that. It's not really, to me, an option here. But there is also mutual benefit here from business engaging with developing countries, and I think we need to demonstrate that and help business see that in a way which maybe they haven't always seen up till now. And the third proposition, I think, is that the NGO community and the university community have a huge amount to offer the business community because of their knowledge and their experience, and we need to exploit that. I would like to think those three propositions were totally non-controversial, but I don't know, maybe some people would argue with them. But I think the next set of questions are certainly very difficult, but they flow from those propositions. The first one is, can we identify specific projects where business and NGO and universities and others can work together more closely to their mutual benefit? In other words, are there hard actions that we can take forward to try and make real difference on very specific areas? And how can we maximise the beneficial impact of that collaboration? Because we're not just looking for activity to be going on, we're looking to activity which will really benefit the poorest and bring the poorest people into the formal societies. And can we assist our developing country partners to meet the challenges of the global economy? Because there is a real world, the competition is intense, and we have to understand that it's impossible to detach ourselves from that hard competition. And then finally, what do we look to government to do? What sort of support do we look for? What kind of channels do we hope them to open up for us in making this work go better?